the smell of expensive espresso, and burning cedar wood. That is what I will always associate with the exact moment my life ended. I was standing barefoot on the imported marble floor of my own penthouse, a glass of sparkling water frozen in my hand. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical whisper against the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. I had just walked out of the master bedroom to get a drink. My steps completely silent on the thick Persian rug running down the hallway. The door to Richard's study was cracked open. Just an inch, but an inch is all it takes for the truth to slip out and slit your throat. The board meeting is on Friday. Richard's voice drifted through the narrow gap. It wasn't his usual voice, the booming, charismatic tone he used at charity galas, or when pouring champagne for our wealthy friends. It was low clinical and laced with a cold amusement that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Is the offshore account fully insulated? That was Trent, his older brother. Trent, who I had loaned $500,000 to last year to save his failing logistics company. Completely, Richard replied. I heard the sharp clink of ice hitting crystal. A celebratory drink. By the time Victoria sits down at that boardroom table, every liquid asset tied to her name will be locked in the Caymans under the shell, LLC. The Sterling estate will be effectively drained. She's bankrupt, Trent. She just doesn't know it yet. And the prenup! Nullified by the morality clause I fabricated with her ex-assistant. It's airtight. She'll walk out of this marriage with nothing but the designer clothes on her back. Richard chuckled. It was a dark, hollow sound. She's too busy running the empire to realise I just stole it out from under her. My fingers went numb. The glass of water in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My throat tightened so violently I thought I was choking on empty air. My stomach contracted a visceral, sickening plunge as the world around me completely dissolved. I am Victoria Sterling. I am 38 years old, the CEO of Sterling Estates, a woman who built a billion-dollar real estate portfolio from the ground up before I even met Richard. I was ruthless in boardrooms, untouchable in negotiations. I wore my composure like a suit of armor, but standing in that hallway, I was nothing but a terrified, foolish woman bleeding out in her own home. I couldn't breathe. I needed to step back. I needed to run. But as I shifted my weight, my foot brushed against a decorative bronze vase resting on the console table. It wobbled. Before it could fall and shatter, a large calloused hand shot out from the shadows of the utility alcove right next to me and caught it. I flinched, biting down on my lip to stop a scream. Standing less than 2 feet away from me was Marcus Vance. He was the head of night shift maintenance for the building, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s, wearing a faded navy blue work shirt with his name stitched over the pocket. He had his heavy tool belt slung low on his hips. I knew him vaguely. I had approved his hiring last year. He was a quiet man, always polite, always keeping his eyes respectfully lowered when the residents passed by. He was supposed to be fixing the faulty HVAC vent in the hallway ceiling tonight. I hadn't seen him in the dark alcove, and neither had Richard. Marcus held the heavy bronze vase perfectly still. His large dark hands were rough, stained with a faint trace of machine oil hands that worked for a living hands that built things rather than breaking them. Slowly, without making a single sound, he placed the vase back onto the marble table. Then he looked at me. There is a specific kind of humiliation that comes with being destroyed in public. But there is a much deeper, more agonizing shame in being destroyed in front of someone from a completely different world. Someone who is supposed to be invisible, in your luxurious life, now witnessing your absolute degradation. I expected pity in his eyes. I expected the awkward, uncomfortable gaze of a working-class man who didn't want to get involved in the messy drama of the ultra-rich. But Marcus didn't look at me with pity. His dark eyes were intensely grounded, completely unreadable, yet radiating a quiet, towering strength. He looked at me with the solemn dignity of a man who understood betrayal, a man who recognized the exact moment a soul fractures. "She suspects nothing." Richard's voice drifted out again, dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "I'll file the divorce papers on Friday morning, 5 minutes before the board meeting. It's going to be a bloodbath, Trent." I felt my knees buckle. The sheer cruelty of it, the man I had slept next to for 4 years, the man I had trusted implicitly, turning my destruction into a game. A tear, hot and humiliating, broke free and rolled down my cheek. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing to collapse against the wall. But I didn't fall. Marcus took one step forward. He didn't touch me, he maintained a respectful, deliberate boundary, but he positioned his large frame between me and the study door, acting as a physical shield. He looked down at me, his jaw tight, and gave a single slow nod. It wasn't just a nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent command. "Do not break here. Do not let them hear you." The contrast between us in that moment was profound. I was dressed in a silk nightgown that cost more than he probably made in a month, standing in a $30 million penthouse. Yet I was utterly powerless, stripped bare of my dignity by the men of my own class. And he, a black single father, working the graveyard shift to make ends meet, a man invisible to the elites of this building, was the only solid thing in my collapsing universe. I swallowed the sob, tearing at my throat. I looked at his worn work boots, then up at his steady eyes. I nodded back, moving with the silent precision of a ghost. Marcus gently guided me away from the study. We walked back down the long hallway, away from the poison, away from the men who were laughing over my grave. When we reached the safety of the main elevator lobby, outside my penthouse, the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us. The silence out here was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of secrets. It was the raw, breathless aftermath of a car crash. I leaned against the cool marble wall, clutching my chest, gasping for air as the panic attack finally hit me. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even wipe away my own tears. Marcus stood a few feet away, giving me space but never taking his eyes off me. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't ask if I was okay, because he knew damn well I wasn't. "I have nothing," I whispered the words, choking me. It was the first time I had spoken the truth aloud. "He took it all. I don't even know how to fight this." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, neatly folded white handkerchief. He didn't hand it to me directly. He placed it on the small table next to me, preserving my dignity. "You don't fight a fire while you're still standing inside the burning house, ma'am," Marcus said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone carrying a weight that only comes from surviving heavy losses. "You get out first. You assess the damage. Then you come back with the water." I looked at him. Truly looked at him for the first time. Behind the exhaustion of a night shift worker, there was an intellect and a protective instinct that Richard could never possess. "He's going to freeze my accounts by morning," I said, my voice trembling. "If I stay here tonight, he'll know I know. If I leave, I have nowhere to go where he can't track me. My family, my friends, they're all tied to him." Marcus checked his heavy silver watch. "My shift ends in 20 minutes. I drive an old Ford truck. No GPS, no luxury tracking. If you need to disappear for a few hours to think I can get you out of this building through the service elevator. It was an insane proposition. I, Victoria Sterling, getting into a beaten-up truck with the nighttime maintenance man in the middle of the night. But as I looked into Marcus's eyes, I saw no greed, no underlying motive. I saw a man extending a quiet, steady hand to someone drowning. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked away for a brief second, a shadow crossing his face. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is about to lose everything they love. And I know what it's like when nobody steps in to help." He turned back to me, his gaze unwavering. "Get dressed, Miss Sterling! Bring only what you can carry. I'll meet you in the underground loading dock in 20 minutes. He turned and walked towards the service elevator. I watched his broad back disappear behind the metal doors. For the first time in my life, the polished, wealthy world I belonged to felt like a graveyard. And the only way out was following a man I barely knew into the dark. I packed with the mechanical efficiency of a woman walking to the guillotine. Back in the penthouse, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the shadows of the master bedroom, my hands trembling as I pulled a small leather duffel bag from the closet. I didn't pack the designer dresses or the custom-tailored suits that defined Victoria Sterling, the untouchable CEO. They felt like costumes now. Heavy, suffocating lies. I grabbed a pair of jeans, a thick cashmere sweater, and my camel trench coat. I opened the wall safe behind the painting. My passport. A thick envelope of emergency cash I had kept there for years, maybe $10,000. It was a drop in the ocean compared to what Richard was currently stealing from me, but tonight, it was my only lifeline. Before I left the room, I stopped at the marble vanity. I looked at the 3-carat diamond wedding ring on my left hand. The stone caught the faint moonlight filtering through the window, glittering with a cold, mocking brilliance. I pulled it off. My finger felt strangely light, a phantom limb of a dead marriage. I placed the ring gently on the marble counter. It made a soft clink. The sound of an empire breaking. The descent down the service elevator was a journey between 2 universes. As the metal box dropped 30 floors, the smell of expensive espresso and cedarwood was replaced by the harsh chemical scent of industrial cleaner and damp concrete. I stepped out into loading bay C. It was a cavernous, dimly lit underground space where the building's trash was compacted and deliveries were made. Beyond the open concrete ramp, a brutal Chicago rainstorm was tearing through the night. The wind howled, whipping sheets of freezing rain against the pavement. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the penthouse finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing terror. I walked toward a massive concrete pillar near the edge of the ramp, out of sight of the security cameras. I pressed my back against the rough, freezing surface. And then I broke. I didn't wail. I didn't scream. Women like me are taught to suffer in silence, to swallow our grief until it calcifies. I slid down the concrete wall until I was sitting on the damp floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I buried my face in my hands, my shoulders shaking violently as silent, agonizing sobs tore through my chest. 14 years of building a legacy. 4 years of marriage. Erased in a whispered conversation over a glass of crystal. I was entirely, devastatingly alone. "Are you lost?" The voice was tiny. A soft bell-like sound, cutting through the heavy rhythm of the rain. I gasped, my head snapping up. I wiped my face frantically, trying to reconstruct the shattered pieces of my composure. Sitting on a stack of flattened cardboard boxes about 10 feet away was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. She had a cloud of beautiful natural curls pulled back into 2 neat puffs, and she was wearing a faded denim jacket over a floral dress. But what caught my eye the most was the bright sunshine yellow backpack sitting next to her on the cardboard. It was such a vibrant, fiercely cheerful colour in this grey, miserable basement. She must have been sitting there quietly, reading the picture book in her lap, waiting for her father's shift to end. I cleared my throat, forcing a brittle professional smile. No, sweetie, I'm not lost. I'm just waiting for someone. The little girl didn't smile back. She just looked at me. Children have a terrifying ability to see right through adult armor. She hopped down from the cardboard boxes, her light-up sneakers flashing briefly against the dark floor. She walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps. As she got closer, the contrast between us was stark. I was a white billionaire in a $3,000 cashmere coat sitting in the dirt. She was a black child from a working-class family, standing tall, looking down at me with a profound, unblinking empathy that completely undid me. She stopped right in front of me and reached into the pocket of her denim jacket. She pulled out a slightly crumpled white paper napkin. It looked like it came from a diner. She held it out to me. My daddy says people don't cry in the dark unless they lost something really important. She said, her voice gentle and matter-of-fact. It's okay if you're sad. You don't have to pretend. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. My chest physically ached. The pristine, wealthy world I lived in was filled with people who would gladly step over my bleeding body to secure a board seat. And here was a 7-year-old girl in an underground loading dock, offering me the only genuine piece of kindness I had received in years. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the crumpled napkin. Thank you, I whispered, my voice breaking entirely. What is your name? Maya, she said proudly. I'm 7 3/4. It is very nice to meet you, Maya. I'm Victoria. Maya, step back, baby bug. Let the lady breathe. The deep, gravelly voice echoed through the concrete bay. I looked up. Marcus Vance was walking toward us. He had changed out of his blue maintenance uniform and was now wearing a thick, worn canvas jacket over a dark sweater. Without the uniform, he didn't look like an employee anymore. He looked massive, imposing, and undeniably grounded. He stopped next to Maya, placing a large, protective hand gently on her shoulder. The way his rough hand rested on her small frame, so careful, so instinctively protective, spoke volumes. She was crying, Papa. Maya looked up at him, her big eyes full of concern. She lost something important. Marcus's gaze shifted from his daughter to me still sitting on the cold floor. His eyes were dark, observant, and devoid of any judgment. He didn't see a fallen CEO. He just saw a human being in pain. I know, baby, Marcus said softly to Maya. He effortlessly scooped her up into his arms, yellow backpack and all. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, resting her head against his shoulder. The bond between them was so visible, so solid, it made my heart ache. Go wait in the truck for me. Turn the heater on, I'll be right there. He set her down near an old dark green Ford F-150 parked in the shadows of the bay. Maya climbed in, shutting the heavy door behind her. Once she was safe inside, Marcus turned back to me. He walked over and stopped a foot away. He didn't offer me his hand right away. He waited, giving me the agency to decide my next move. The security cameras in this bay loop every 24 hours. He said, his voice low over the sound of the rain. I disabled the one pointing at the service elevator 10 minutes ago. There's no footage of you coming down here. I stared at him, stunned. He wasn't just helping me hide. He was actively protecting my exit. He was thinking 3 steps ahead, covering my tracks against a husband who had all the power and resources in the world. Mr. Vance? Marcus. Oh. I corrected myself using his first name for the first time. It felt necessary. Titles belonged to the world upstairs. Down here, we were just survivors. If Richard finds out you helped me... Richard Sterling doesn't look at men like me, Marcus interrupted smoothly, stating a cold, hard fact of class and race. He sees a uniform. He sees invisible labor. He doesn't see a threat. That's his first mistake. Marcus finally extended his hand. It was an invitation to step out of the wreckage. I looked at his calloused palm. For my entire life, I had been the one in control. I pulled the strings, I signed the checks, I made the calls. Surrendering my safety to a man I barely knew went against every instinct I had ever honed in the corporate world. But as I looked at the old Ford truck where a little girl with a yellow backpack was waiting, I realized something profound. Wealth had bought me a penthouse, but it hadn't bought me a single loyal ally. I reached up and placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and incredibly strong. He pulled me up from the concrete floor with ease, steadying me as I found my footing in my boots. My truck isn't pretty, Ms. Sterling, Marcus said, leading me toward the vehicle. But the heater works, and nobody is going to look for a billionaire in the passenger seat of a 15-year-old Ford. He opened the heavy creaking door of the truck for me. The interior smelled like worn leather faint engine oil and peppermint. It wasn't the smell of cedar wood and deception. It smelled like reality. I climbed in. Maya was sitting in the middle seat, swinging her legs. She looked up at me and offered a small, shy smile. Marcus shut my door, walked around the front of the truck through the pouring rain, and climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key, and the old engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. As he shifted the truck into gear, and we pulled out of the underground bay, into the freezing Chicago storm, I looked back at the towering glass skyscraper that I owned. The penthouse at the very top was dark. I had lost my empire. But as the truck's heater blasted warm air over my freezing hands and a little girl's yellow backpack brushed against my arm, I realized I was finally safe. The rain beat against the windshield of the Ford F-150 in heavy rhythmic sheets, blurring the glowing streetlights of Chicago into long streaks of gold and red. Inside the cab, the only sounds were the steady hum of the heater and the soft, even breathing of Maya, who had fallen asleep with her head resting against my arm. I sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring at the illuminated screen of my phone. At 1:14 a.m., the first notification appeared. A polite clinical ping from my private banking app. Access denied. Account credentials have been modified. My thumb hovered over the screen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I switched to my Platinum American Express app. Card suspended. Please contact the primary account holder. A cold, breathless void opened up in the pit of my stomach. Richard hadn't waited until Friday. The moment I left the penthouse, he must have realized I was gone. He was accelerating the timeline, sealing the trap, while I was still wandering in the dark. In less than 2 hours, a woman who controlled a billion-dollar real estate portfolio had been digitally erased. I was effectively a ghost. He locked them! I whispered to the dark windshield. The words tasted like ash. The accounts, the cards, everything. I can't even book a hotel room. Marcus didn't swerve. He didn't hit the brakes. He just glanced at the rearview mirror, his profile cast in the dim amber glow of the dashboard lights. "Then it's a good thing we aren't going to a hotel," he said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. It was the grounded, unshakable tone of a man who had faced worse storms than a frozen bank account. He took the next exit, steering the heavy truck away from the polished glass and steel of downtown Chicago, heading south into a neighborhood of brick walk-ups and narrow tree-lined streets. This was a world of working-class survival, a place Richard Sterling would only ever view from the tinted windows of a town car. Marcus parked the truck on a quiet street in front of a 3-story brick building. He turned off the engine and gently unbuckled Maya. She stirred, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Come on, baby bug," Marcus murmured, lifting her effortlessly into his arms and pulling his canvas jacket over her to shield her from the rain. "We're home." He looked at me over the roof of the truck. "It's the 3rd floor. Watch your step. The stairs get slick in the rain." I pulled my cashmere coat tight around my shoulders, grabbed my leather duffel bag, and followed him. There was no marble lobby here. No doorman in a brass-buttoned uniform. Just a heavy wooden door that stuck a little at the bottom and a narrow staircase with faded floral wallpaper. My leather boots clicked against the worn wooden steps, the sound echoing in the quiet stairwell. When Marcus unlocked his door and pushed it open, he didn't offer the reflexive, embarrassed apology that most people make when bringing someone wealthy into their modest home. He didn't say, "Excuse the mess," or "It's not much." He possessed a quiet, structural dignity that didn't require him to apologize for the life he provided for his daughter. "Come in, Miss Sterling," he said, stepping aside. I walked into the apartment. It was small, perhaps a fifth the size of my master bedroom, but it was immaculately clean. The furniture was old, but deeply cared for. A worn chocolate-brown corduroy sofa sat in the center of the living room. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed tight with everything from engineering manuals to classic literature and brightly colored children's books. A small dining table with 3 mismatched chairs sat near a galley kitchen. It was a space built entirely around love and necessity. I stood awkwardly near the door, a woman wearing $3,000 worth of clothing, carrying $10,000 in cash in my bag, yet feeling entirely impoverished compared to the warmth of this room. Marcus carried Maya to a small bedroom down the short hall. I heard the low murmur of his voice, the soft rustle of blankets. When he emerged a few minutes later, he had taken off his wet jacket. "She's down," he said quietly. He pointed to the sofa. "Take your coat off before the damp sets into your bones. Have a seat." I slowly peeled off my damp trench coat and draped it over the back of a wooden chair. I sat down on the edge of the corduroy sofa. It was soft-yielding in a way the sharp, minimalist furniture in my penthouse never was. The tension in my lower back, wound tight as a piano wire for the last 3 hours, finally began to slacken. Marcus walked into the small kitchen. He didn't ask if I was hungry. He just turned on the stove. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice sounding incredibly fragile in the quiet apartment. "You've already done enough. If Richard tracks my phone here..." "He won't," Marcus interrupted, striking a match and lighting the gas burner. A small ring of blue flame flared to life. "This building is an old brick fortress. Cell reception is dead in this unit, unless you stand by the fire escape. As far as the GPS is concerned, your phone signal dropped out over the river." He pulled a cast-iron skillet from a hook. "Besides, you can't strategize on an empty stomach. Your brain is running on adrenaline and shock. That's how you make mistakes." I watched him move around the kitchen. There was an economy to his movements, a practiced grace of a single father, who had made 1,000 late-night meals. He buttered thick slices of bread-cracked eggs into a bowl and sliced sharp cheddar cheese. The smell of melting butter and toasting bread began to fill the apartment. It was such a profoundly ordinary smell, yet it hit me with the force of a physical blow. For the last 4 years, my meals had been catered by private chefs served on bone china, in dining rooms designed for magazine covers. But I had never felt cared for. I had only been managed. Suddenly, I heard the soft padding of small feet. Maya appeared in the hallway. She was wearing oversized yellow pajamas, dragging a thick knitted fleece blanket behind her. "Maya, you're supposed to be asleep. Bug," Marcus said softly from the stove, though there was no real reprimand in his voice. She ignored him, walking straight up to where I was sitting on the sofa. She held out the blanket. "You're shivering!" Maya said, her big observant eyes locked onto mine. "This is my magic blanket. It keeps the cold out and the nightmares away. You need it more than I do tonight." My throat seized. The corporate armor I had spent my entire adult life building completely shattered. I took the blanket in my hands, trembling, and wrapped it around my shoulders. It smelled like lavender laundry detergent and safety. "Thank you, Maya!" I managed to whisper, a fresh tear escaping and tracking down my cheek. It's very magic." She smiled a genuine radiant thing before padding over to her father. Marcus leaned down, kissed the top of her head, and whispered something in her ear that made her giggle. She turned and trotted back to her bedroom, leaving the door cracked open just an inch. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, staring at the cracked door. She is a remarkable child, Marcus. She saved my life," he said simply. He slid the grilled cheese and eggs onto a ceramic plate and walked over, placing it on the small coffee table in front of me. He set down a mug of hot black tea next to it. He didn't sit on the sofa next to me. He took the armchair opposite the table, giving me space, leaning forward with his forearms resting on his knees. "Eat," he instructed gently. I picked up the sandwich. My hands were still shaking slightly, but as I took the first bite, the simple hot food grounded me. It was the best thing I had tasted in years. "My husband," I started, my voice finally finding a steady octave, "is going to use a fabricated morality clause to nullify our prenuptial agreement. He's shifting my liquid assets into an offshore LLC before the board meeting on Friday morning. He wants to walk into that room and announce that I am financially compromised, forcing the board to strip me of my CEO title." Marcus watched me, his dark eyes sharp, absorbing the data. "He needs the board's vote to remove you. Yes, but they are sharks. If they smell blood, if they think my personal finances are a liability to the company's stock, they will vote me out in a heartbeat. Richard knows that. He's engineered the perfect corporate assassination. A perfect plan relies on the victim doing what she's supposed to do," Marcus said quietly. "He expects you to panic. He expects you to hire expensive lawyers tomorrow morning fighting a defensive war you can't win because your accounts are frozen. Then what do? I asked, looking across the table at this quiet man who had become my only sanctuary. Marcus leaned back in the armchair, the shadows of the room carving sharp angles into his face. "We don't fight him in a courtroom," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, decisive timbre. "We fight him in the building. You own the penthouse, Ms. Sterling, but I run the systems. And tomorrow night we are going to open Richard Sterling up from the inside." I woke up to the smell of roasted coffee and the soft rhythmic scratching of a crayon against paper. For a fraction of a second, my brain expected the heavy soundproofed silence of the penthouse. Then the rough texture of the corduroy sofa scratched against my cheek, and the weight of Maya's yellow fleece blanket settled over my chest. The memories of the previous night crashed down on me, the whispered betrayal, the frozen bank accounts, the rain-slicked escape. I sat up slowly, my muscles aching. Sunlight was filtering through the metal slats of the fire escape outside the single window, casting long, geometric shadows across the small living room. Maya was sitting cross-legged on the faded rug, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, as she coloured a picture of a ridiculously disproportionate purple dragon. When she heard me shift, she looked up and offered a bright, gap-toothed smile. "Good morning, Victoria," she whispered, treating my name with a careful, rehearsed respect. "Papa went down to the corner store to get fresh milk. He said to let you sleep until you woke up on your own." "Good morning, Maya," I replied, my voice thick with sleep and lingering exhaustion. "Your dragon is very beautiful," she beamed, turning back to her artwork. I stood up, folding the yellow blanket with meticulous care, trying to instill some order into my chaotic reality. As I placed it on the armrest, my eyes were drawn to a small wooden bookshelf near the television. Amidst the engineering manuals and worn paperbacks, there was a single silver-framed photograph. I walked over to it, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. It was a picture of Marcus. He looked a few years younger, the lines around his eyes less pronounced. He was wearing a simple white button-down shirt, and he was holding a woman from behind his chin, resting on her shoulder. She was a stunning black woman with a radiant, open smile, her hands resting softly over his large ones. The way they looked at the camera, no, the way they existed in that frame was so full of profound, unshakable love that it made my chest physically ache. Her name was Sarah. I jumped spinning around. Marcus was standing in the doorway, a brown paper bag in one hand. I hadn't heard him come up the stairs. In the daylight, without the heavy canvas jacket, the sheer physical presence of the man was even more striking. But his eyes were soft as they landed on the photograph. "I'm sorry," I said, quickly taking a step back, feeling like I had intruded on holy ground. "Oh, she's beautiful." Marcus walked into the kitchen, setting the bag on the counter. He didn't look away from the picture. "She was a kindergarten teacher. We met when we were 22. We had Maya when we were 34. He pulled a carton of milk from the bag. His voice was steady, but it carried the heavy, resonant weight of a man who had survived a catastrophic impact. "Ovarian cancer. She passed away 3 years ago." I felt a sudden sharp sting of tears behind my eyes. "Marcus, I'm so sorry." The treatments were experimental at the end. He continued, quietly pouring the milk into a small glass for Maya. "Insurance wouldn't cover it. We sold the house we had just bought in South Shore. We drained the savings, the retirement accounts, everything. When she died, I was left with a mountain of medical debt, a 4-year-old daughter, and an empty bank account." He picked up 2 ceramic mugs and poured the dark, steaming coffee from a glass carafe. He walked over and handed one to me. "I tell you this, Victoria, so you understand something," Marcus said, looking directly into my eyes. "You lost your money last night. You lost a man who never truly loved you. But you did not lose your life. You did not lose your mind. Richard Sterling took your assets, but he cannot take what you are actually made of. You are still breathing. That means you are still in the fight." I gripped the warm ceramic mug, the heat radiating into my cold palms. The sheer magnitude of his dignity dwarfed my own tragedy. I had spent the night mourning a billion-dollar empire and a plastic marriage. Marcus had lost his soulmate, his home, his financial stability. And yet he had emerged with his humanity entirely intact, raising a beautiful daughter with grace in a tiny apartment. I realized with a sudden breathtaking clarity that I would gladly trade every penthouse and offshore account I had ever owned just to be loved by a man the way Marcus had loved Sarah. "You're right," I whispered, lifting my chin, the CEO armor slowly knitting itself back together, not out of coldness this time, but out of resilience. "I'm still in the fight, but how do we prove he fabricated the morality clause? How do we stop the board vote tomorrow?" Marcus took a sip of his coffee. A faint, sharp smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Rich men make one fundamental mistake when they build their fortresses, Victoria. They think the glass and the marble are what hold the power." He walked over to the closet and pulled out a heavy, thick black laptop, the kind used for industrial diagnostics. He carried it to the small dining table and flipped it open. "They forget about the people who lay the cables," Marcus said. I sat down next to him, the faint scent of peppermint and machine oil wrapping around me. Our shoulders were inches apart. When Richard had his private elevator installed in the penthouse, he demanded that the security cameras in the cab be deactivated. Marcus explained his large fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard, bringing up a complex dark-screened command terminal. "He filed a privacy injunction with the building's management. My boss ordered me to cut the feed to the main security lobby. So he's been using it to bring his accomplices in without a trace," I said, my jaw tightening. "The ex-assistant, Chloe, the woman who was supposedly going to testify that she caught me violating the morality clause of the prenup." "He thought he was untraceable," Marcus corrected. "But the Sterling building operates on an integrated closed-loop biometric server. Protocol dictates that no camera can be fully powered down without triggering a fire code violation. So I didn't cut the power. I just rerouted the video feed from the lobby monitors directly into the basement server's encrypted archive." My eyes widened. "You have the footage." "I have everything," Marcus said softly. He hit the enter key. A grid of 6 video windows popped up on the screen. He clicked on one, maximizing it. It was the interior of Richard's private elevator. The timestamp in the corner read 2 weeks ago, 11:30 p.m. The door slid open and Richard walked in. A second later, Chloe, my former assistant, stepped in behind him. She was young, ambitious, and supposedly fired for incompetence a month ago. I held my breath as I watched the silent black and white footage. The doors closed. Richard turned to Chloe. He didn't look like a boss talking to a former employee. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He handed it to her. She took it smiling and then grabbed his lapels, pulling him into a deep, aggressive kiss. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. The pain of the infidelity was eclipsed by the sheer, undeniable proof of the fraud. "That envelope?" I pointed at the screen, my finger trembling slightly. "That's the payoff. That's her advance for signing the false affidavit." "There's more," Marcus said. His voice was a low rumble right next to my ear. He minimized the video and opened a network diagnostic log. Rows of IP addresses and data packets scrolled across the screen. "Your penthouse Wi-Fi router is routed through the building's central ISP. Last night at 11:55 p.m., 20 minutes after we left the hallway, Richard authorized a massive encrypted data packet transfer to an IP address registered to Trent's logistics firm. I ran a packet sniff on the headers. It contains the digital signatures for the Cayman LLC transfers." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "He did it on the building's network." I whispered, the realization washing over me like ice water. He was so arrogant, so sure I was asleep. He didn't even bother to use a secure off-site VPN. He didn't think anyone was watching, Marcus said. I turned my head to look at him. His face was mere inches from mine. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the deep, intelligent intensity in his dark eyes. He wasn't just a maintenance worker. He was a master of his domain, an invisible architect who had just handed me the weapon to destroy the men who thought they owned the world. Can you download all of this? I asked, my voice barely a breath. The video, the network logs, the packet headers. I already did, Marcus said. He reached into his pocket and placed a small silver USB drive onto the table. It landed with a soft metallic click. I looked at the drive. Then I looked at Marcus. Without thinking, I reached out and covered his hand with mine. His skin was rough, calloused, and incredibly warm. My manicured, trembling fingers looked so fragile against his, but he didn't pull away. He turned his hand over his large fingers, gently wrapping around mine, offering a silent grounding strength that anchored me to the earth. Tomorrow is the charity gala for the Sterling Foundation, I said, my voice hardening into steel. Richard is hosting it. The entire board of directors will be there. He plans to play the devoted husband before executing me at the board meeting the next morning. Marcus's thumb lightly brushed the back of my hand. And what do you want to do, Victoria? I looked at the USB drive, then back into the eyes of the man who had saved my life. I want to burn his fortress to the ground, I said, in front of everyone. The Sterling Foundation Charity Gala was held in the grand atrium of the Sterling Building, a sprawling 4-story expanse of glass-polished granite and suspended crystal chandeliers. It was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. Tonight, it was supposed to be my graveyard. I spent $4,000 of my emergency cash that afternoon at a boutique on the Magnificent Mile. I didn't buy a dress. I bought an impeccably tailored ice-white silk suit. It was sharp architectural and completely unforgiving. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe twist and painted my lips a deep matte crimson. When I stepped out of the Blacktown car I had paid for in cash and walked through the revolving glass doors of the atrium, the flash of society photographers' cameras briefly blinded me. I didn't blink. I didn't falter. I walked into the gala like a woman who owned the world, because for the next 12 hours, I still did. The low hum of the jazz quartet and the clinking of champagne flutes filled the massive space. The room was packed with the elite of Chicago senators, real estate tycoons, and most importantly, the entire board of directors for Sterling Estates. I spotted Richard immediately. He was standing near the center ice sculpture holding court with Trent and 3 of the most influential board members. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, laughing expansively at something someone had said. He looked like a man who had already won the war. Then he saw me. The laugh died in his throat. His charismatic smile froze, turning brittle at the edges. He had expected me to be hiding in a cheap motel, paralyzed by the frozen accounts, weeping over my lost empire. He had not expected me to walk into his victory party wearing white armor. He excused himself from the board members and walked toward me, his steps quick and aggressive. When he reached me, he leaned in, pressing a kiss to my cheek for the cameras. "What the hell are you doing here?" He hissed, his voice a venomous whisper against my ear. I smiled radiantly, turning my head slightly so the photographers could capture the image of the perfect power couple. "It's my foundation, Richard. Did you really think I'd miss the gala? Your credit cards were declined across the city this morning," he murmured, his fingers gripping my waist just a fraction too tight, crossing the line from affectionate to controlling. "I know you're running on fumes, Victoria. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. If you cause a scene tonight, I swear to God I will have security drag you out by your hair." "You can't afford a scene any more than I can, darling," I replied smoothly, stepping out of his grip. "So, let's just smile and pour the champagne." I walked away from him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my exterior remained perfectly composed. In my silver clutch purse, pressed against my palm, was the small metal USB drive Marcus had given me. It was the grenade that would level this entire room. I just had to wait for the morning. As the evening progressed, Richard grew increasingly agitated. My calm demeanor was unnerving him. He needed to reassert his dominance to feel powerful in a room where he was secretly operating on borrowed time. He found his opportunity near the main stage. The event's audio-visual system had experienced a minor feedback loop during one of the speeches. Marcus, acting as the head of building operations, had been called up from the basement to address the issue. He was standing near the side of the stage, wearing his crisp, dark navy uniform, adjusting a heavy soundboard. Even in the shadows, his presence was magnetic. He worked with quiet, practiced efficiency, ignoring the glittering wealth swirling around him. Richard, holding a fresh glass of scotch, walked over to the soundboard, flanked by Trent, and two board members, Arthur and William. I was standing about 20 feet away, speaking to a senator's wife, but my eyes locked onto the scene instantly. "Vance, isn't it?" Richard said loudly. Too loudly. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died down. Marcus paused, taking his hands off the soundboard. He turned to face Richard, his expression perfectly neutral. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. The feedback loop has been isolated. The system is stable." "Is it?" Richard sneered, taking a sip of his scotch. "Because when I pay top dollar for infrastructure management, I expect competence. Not amateur hour from the night shift." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't lower his eyes. "The issue was caused by a wireless frequency overlap from the news crews outside, sir. It has been patched." Richard hated that. He hated that Marcus wasn't cowering. He hated the quiet, unshakable dignity radiating from a man he considered beneath him. "You people always have an excuse," Richard said. The words hung in the air. "You people." It was the coded, insidious language of the boardroom racist, just ambiguous enough to maintain plausible deniability, but sharp enough to draw blood. Trent smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. Arthur and William shifted uncomfortably, but they said nothing. Wealth protects wealth. My blood turned to boiling lead. My fingers curled into fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. I took a step forward, ready to tear Richard's throat out. But as I moved, Marcus's eyes flicked to mine. It was a fraction of a second. A microscopic shake of his head. "No, hold the line. Do not ruin the plan for my ego." I stopped my breath, shuddering in my chest. Richard, emboldened by the silence, took it a step further. He deliberately tipped his glass of scotch, letting a splash of the amber liquid spill onto the polished granite floor, right next to Marcus's heavy work boots. "Clean that up, Vance!" Richard ordered, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt. "And try not to be so slow about it. We have important guests." The cruelty of the moment was suffocating. Richard was demanding that the head of operations get on his hands and knees in front of the city's elite, reducing a proud, intelligent black man to a servant just to stroke his own fragile ego. The silence in the room stretched tight as a drum. Marcus looked at the spilled scotch on the floor. Then he looked at Richard. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly pitying. With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus reached for the radio clipped to his belt. He pressed the button. "Custodial to the main stage, please. We have a spill," Marcus said into the radio, his voice a deep, resonant calm that echoed over the ambient noise of the gala. He released the button, looked Richard dead in the eye, and said, "My job is to keep the building from collapsing, Mr. Sterling. The janitorial staff will handle your mess." Richard's face flushed a dark, furious red. The blatant yet perfectly professional refusal was a massive blow to his pride in front of the board. He opened his mouth to shout to fire Marcus on the spot, but Trent quickly put a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something about the cameras. Richard swallowed his rage, shooting Marcus a look of pure hatred. "We'll be reviewing your employment file on Monday, Vance!" He spat before turning and storming back into the crowd. Marcus stood his ground. He didn't look victorious. He just looked like a man who knew exactly who he was. Our eyes met across the room once more. The contrast between us had never been more agonizing. I was wearing white silk, mingling with the monsters who had just tried to strip him of his humanity. He was wearing a uniform, standing in the shadows, bearing the weight of their prejudice. Yet I had never respected a human being more in my entire life. I turned away, gripping the silver clutch purse so hard, my knuckles turned white. The USB drive felt heavy dense with impending justice. "Enjoy your scotch, Richard," I thought, staring at the back of my husband's head as he laughed with the board. "Because tomorrow morning, I am going to take everything." The boardroom of Sterling Estates was located on the 42nd floor. It was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation walls of soundproof glass, a massive table carved from a single slab of dark mahogany, and panoramic views of a city that looked small and conquerable from this height. At exactly 9 a.m. on Friday, I walked into the room. I was wearing the same white silk suit from the gala. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask. The 12 members of the board of directors were already seated. Richard was standing at the head of the table, his lawyer seated beside him. Trent was leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, trying to suppress a predatory smirk. The air in the room was thick, charged with the electric anticipation of a public execution. "Victoria!" Richard said. He didn't sound angry today. He sounded grave, employing the sorrowful tone of a man forced to do something terrible for the greater good. "Please take a seat." I didn't sit. I walked to the opposite end of the mahogany table and stood behind my leather chair, resting my hands lightly on the headrest. "I prefer to stand, Richard." "Let's get this over with." "I have a busy morning." Richard sighed, shaking his head. He looked at the board members. Arthur and William, the men from the gala, refused to meet my eyes. It is with a profound sense of personal and professional regret that I called this emergency meeting. Richard began placing a thick manila folder onto the table. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, I have officially filed for divorce from Victoria Sterling." A low murmur rippled through the room. Board members shifted in their seats. "Furthermore," Richard raised his voice slightly to cut through the noise, "I'm exercising the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement. I have sworn affidavits from staff members, including Victoria's former executive assistant, Chloe, detailing multiple indiscretions that violate the terms of our marriage, and by extension, cast a severe shadow on the moral integrity of this company." He paused, letting the lie hang in the air, thick and suffocating. "Because the prenup is nullified," Richard continued. "Our assets are currently undergoing a mandatory division protocol. However, upon reviewing the financials, it has come to my attention that Victoria's personal accounts are severely over-leveraged. As of this morning, she is effectively insolvent." Trent nodded solemnly from the back wall. The sharks were smelling the blood. The bylaws of Sterling Estates are clear, Richard said, looking directly at Arthur. The CEO must maintain financial solvency to hold the position. An insolvent CEO is a liability to the stock price and the shareholders. Therefore, I am calling for an immediate board vote to strip Victoria Sterling of her title and remove her from the company, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard looked at me, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. He had done it. He had built the perfect guillotine and pulled the lever. "Are you finished, Richard?" I asked. My voice was perfectly calm, devoid of a single tremor. Richard frowned, clearly unsettled by my lack of panic. "I am just trying to protect the company, Victoria." "How noble of you!" I murmured. I unclasped my silver clutch purse. I didn't pull out a handkerchief to wipe away tears. I didn't pull out a lawyer's business card. I pulled out the small silver USB drive Marcus had given me. I walked over to the presentation podium built into the center of the table. I slid the drive into the port. "You've built a fascinating narrative this morning, Richard," I said, tapping the touchscreen to bring the projector online. The massive screen behind Richard flickered to life. "But there is a fatal flaw in your story. You assume you are the smartest man in the building." I clicked the first file. The black and white security footage from Richard's private elevator filled the screen. The timestamp glowed brightly in the corner. The board members leaned forward, squinting. They watched Richard walk in. They watched Chloe, my star witness, step in behind him. They watched Richard hand her the thick white envelope. And then they watched the deep, undeniable kiss that followed. "This," I said, my voice slicing through the shocked gasps echoing around the table, "is Richard Sterling paying off my former assistant to sign a fabricated affidavit. This is perjury, extortion, and fraud." Richard's face drained of all colour. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "Where did you get that?" Richard choked out, stepping back from the screen as if it were radioactive. "That camera was deactivated. I have the paperwork." "You have paperwork," I countered smoothly. "I have the truth." I clicked the next file. The network diagnostic log scrolled down the screen, rows of IP addresses highlighted in stark red. "This," I continued, "is a packet sniff of the building's secure server. It shows that Richard Sterling used company infrastructure, Sterling Estates' private ISP, to illegally wire millions of dollars in marital assets to an offshore shell company." I pointed a finger directly at Trent, who was now frozen against the wall. "A shell company registered to Trent Sterling." The room erupted. "Federal wire fraud!" Arthur shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You used company servers for personal embezzlement." William demanded, his face purple with rage. "Are you out of your mind, Richard? You just opened up Sterling Estates to an SEC investigation." The board wasn't angry that Richard had cheated on me. They were furious that his sloppy arrogance had endangered their money. "It's fake!" Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked frantically at his lawyer, who was already quietly packing his briefcase, preparing to distance himself from a sinking ship. "She fabricated this! You can't trust these logs." The logs are encrypted and biometrically sealed by the building's central mainframe, I said, stepping away from the podium and walking slowly toward Richard. Every step I took echoed with the sound of a closing casket. "They are irrefutable, and my attorneys have already forwarded them to the FBI Cybercrimes Division along with the video." Richard backed up until he hit the glass wall. His charismatic facade had completely melted away, leaving only a pathetic, desperate man. "Victoria, please," he whispered, his voice trembling. We can fix this. We can talk about this. We are done talking, I said, stopping 2 feet away from him. You are fired from the board, Richard. You will be escorted out of this building by security. Your assets will be frozen pending the federal investigation. You are going to leave this room with nothing. I turned my back on him and looked at the 12 board members. They were silent, staring at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Before we conclude, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre, I want to address a critical security vulnerability in this company. It isn't a firewall. It isn't a rogue employee. I looked directly at Arthur and William. Last night, at the charity gala, this board stood by and watched as Richard humiliated the head of our building operations. You watched him pour scotch on the floor and demand that a black man get on his hands and knees to clean it up. You laughed. You looked the other way. Arthur swallowed hard, looking down at his expensive leather shoes. William suddenly found the mahogany grain of the table fascinating. You dismissed Marcus Vance, I said, making sure every single person in the room heard his name. You saw a working-class single father. You saw a uniform. You saw someone you thought was beneath your dignity to even acknowledge. I pointed to the massive screen behind me where the undeniable proof of my victory was still glowing. Marcus Vance is the man who pulled these logs. Marcus Vance is the man who secured the camera feeds. The man you ordered to clean up your spill is the man who just saved this billion-dollar company from a catastrophic federal indictment. He saw what you were too blind and too arrogant to see. The shame in the room was palpable. It hung heavy in the air, suffocating the wealthy elites who suddenly realized that the foundation of their entire world was maintained by the very people they stepped on. If I said, my eyes sweeping across the table, catch a single member of this board treating any member of our staff with anything less than absolute respect, I will personally see to it that you are ruined. Do we have an understanding? 12 heads nodded in silent, terrified unison. I turned back to Richard. 2 large security guards had already entered the room, responding to the silent alarm I had triggered under the podium. Take his key card, I instructed the guards, and escort Mr. Sterling out through the underground loading dock. He doesn't deserve to use the front door. I watched them take him away. The man who had tried to destroy me was dragged out of his own fortress, broken and humiliated. The war was over. I had my empire back. But as I stood in that multi-million-dollar boardroom, surrounded by the most powerful people in the city, I realized that none of this was where my heart was anymore. I looked at the silver USB drive in my hand. It didn't feel like a weapon of corporate warfare. It felt like an invitation. A meeting adjourned, I said quietly. I left the files on the desk, walked out of the glass doors, and headed straight for the elevator. I had a dinner to cook. I didn't go back to the penthouse. Even though Richard's keycard was deactivated and the locks were being changed by building security, the $30 million space in the sky felt like a tomb. It was a museum of a life I no longer wanted to live. Instead, I walked out of the Sterling building, hailed a cab, and gave the driver an address on the south side. I stopped at a local grocery store, a regular brightly lit neighborhood market, not the artisanal boutique my private chef used. I walked down the aisles in my thousands of dollars white silk suit, pushing a slightly squeaky shopping cart. For the first time in years, I felt incredibly, wonderfully normal. I bought fresh vegetables, a whole roasting chicken, garlic butter, and a loaf of warm, crusty bread. I also bought a box of brightly coloured crayons and a new sketchbook. When I reached the 3-story brick walk-up, I didn't need to knock. Marcus had given me a spare brass key that morning, pressing it into my palm with a quiet nod before he left for his shift. I climbed the narrow staircase with the faded floral wallpaper. The sound of my heels on the wood felt different this time. It didn't feel like I was running away. It felt like I was arriving. I let myself into the apartment. The late afternoon sun was pouring through the single window, casting a warm golden glow over the corduroy sofa. I took off my white silk jacket, draped it over the chair, and rolled up the sleeves of my blouse. I walked into the tiny galley kitchen, turned on the gas stove, and went to work. 2 hours later, the apartment was filled with the rich, savoury aroma of roasted chicken garlic and melting butter. I was setting the small dining table with the 3 mismatched chairs when I heard the heavy click of the front door unlocking. The door swung open. Maya walked in first, her yellow backpack sliding off one shoulder. Marcus was right behind her, wearing his heavy canvas jacket, carrying a lunchbox in his large hand. Maya stopped in her tracks. Her big, expressive eyes widened as she took in the smell of the food, and then she saw me standing by the table. "Victoria!" she gasped. She didn't hesitate. She dropped her yellow backpack on the floor and ran toward me. I knelt down just in time to catch her as she threw her small arms around my neck. The sheer force of her innocent, unhesitating affection knocked the breath right out of me. I closed my eyes, burying my face in her soft curls, holding her tight. "You came back," Maya whispered against my shoulder. "I told you," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. "I had to bring back the magic blanket." I stood up, holding Maya's hand, and looked across the room at Marcus. He was standing perfectly still by the door. He had taken off his jacket, and the exhaustion of a long shift was etched into the lines around his eyes. But as he looked at me standing in his kitchen, wearing an apron over my designer clothes, holding his daughter's hand, the exhaustion melted away. His dark eyes softened, radiating a quiet, profound warmth that made my heart physically skip a beat. He walked slowly into the kitchen, his heavy boots making no sound. He stopped right in front of me. He didn't ask about Richard. He didn't ask about the board meeting, or the stock prices, or the federal investigation. He already knew. "You look tired, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice a deep, gentle rumble. "I won the war, Marcus," I said softly, looking up into his face. "But I think I'm done fighting." Marcus reached out. His large, calloused hand gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my jawline, a touch that was feather-light, yet grounded with an immense protective strength. My eyes fluttered shut for a brief second, leaning into his warmth. "Then it's time to rest," he whispered. We sat down at the small table. It was cramped. The plates barely fit, and my elbow bumped against Marcus's arm every time I reached for the water pitcher. But as I watched Maya excitedly colour in her new sketchbook between bites of chicken, and as I listened to Marcus's deep, rumbling laugh filling the small room, I realised the absolute truth. Richard had tried to leave me bankrupt. He had tried to strip me of everything I owned. But sitting in this tiny apartment on the south side, listening to the rain start to patter against the window pane, I knew I had never been richer. The marble floors and the offshore accounts were just numbers on a screen. True wealth was the calloused hand of a good man holding yours under the table. True wealth was a little girl in a yellow backpack who wasn't afraid to love you when you had nothing. I looked at Marcus, and he looked back at me, his thumb gently tracing the back of my hand. There was no rush. No grand declarations were needed. The storm was outside, but in here, the foundation was solid. And for the first time in my life, I was finally home. If this story spoke to you, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Which moment softened your heart the most? Do you believe more in the power of late regret for those who do wrong, or in the quiet healing of those who survive it? And do you think a child's innocent words can truly change an adult's heart? Share your experience in the comments. And while you're there, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I read more of your comments than you might expect. If these stories resonate with you, please like the video and subscribe. There are many more stories about life, family, and the choices that shape us. Thank you for listening.